It is an honor for me to present, although it is not necessary, I imagine, for all or almost all people here. It's an honor for me to present Paulo and Miller, and I thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in the symposium and in the book, especially since this is a topic you have been working on so extensively in the recent times. Paulo Miller is a Carolina Distinguished Professor at the University of South Carolina. He is the former editor of Transactions of the American Philological Association. He is the author of 10 books, including Lyric Texts and Lyric Consciousness, 1994, Subjecting Verses, 2004, Postmodern Spiritual Practices, 2007, Plato's Apology of Socrates, 2010, Diotima at the Barricades, French Feminists Read Plato, 2015, and Horace, 2019. He has edited 15 volumes of essays and published more than 90 articles on Latin, Greek, French, and English literature, theory, and philosophy. His book, Foucault's Seminars on Antiquity, Learning to Speak the Truth, was just published by Bloomsbury. I'm looking forward to reading it. And today, he is going to present a talk with the title, The Problem of the Dandy in the Aesthetics of Existence, Foucault's Dialogue with Hadot, Kant, and Baudelaire. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and it's been a very stimulating morning here. I put the handout for the talk in the chat, so and it just has the passages that I talk about, and it goes in order, so it should be pretty self-evident. I'm going to start off with a brief quotation from Baudelaire. C'est un cri répété par mille sentinelles, un ordre renvoyé par mille porte-voix. C'est un phare allumé sur mille citadelles, un appel de chasseurs perdus dans les grands bois. Car c'est vraiment, Seigneur, le meilleur témoignage que nous puissions donner de notre dignité, que cet ardent sanglot qui roule d'âge en âge et vient mourir au bord de votre éternité. The notion of the dandy originates in the late 18th century in such frivolous and immaculately coiffed individuals as Beau Brummel and the French king of Naples, Joachim Murat. It is, however, only in Baudelaire as the painter of modern life that dandyism receives its first real definition as a concept and begins to function as a theoretical operator, as an articulated mode of relation to the world. The centrality of the aesthetic for Baudelaire's understanding of modernity is not doubted, yet while he is not an austere philosopher in the manner of a Seneca, a Descartes, or a Kant, it would be a mistake to see his embrace of the dandy as pure frivolity, as signaling a refusal of philosophical, political, or moral seriousness. Rather, this essay offers his fullest elaboration of what he understands as l'art moderne and its critical engagement with the world. L'homme finit par ressembler à ce qu'il voudrait être, is a sentence whose import merits serious reflection, as it suggests that each of us forms ourselves in the image of our desire, that is, according to an unstated vision of what we and the world should be. This critical ontology is not limited to a single essay. Indeed, the aesthetics of resistance is on evidence throughout Les Fleurs du Mal, a consciousness of the artist as social, spiritual, and ethical critic. Thus in Les Phares, whose final stanzas I just read, Baudelaire fashions a concise history of painting from Da Vinci to Delacroix by way of Rubens, Michelangelo, and Watteau. Each of these masters stands as a lighthouse, recalling the original Pharos of Alexandria, illuminating the surrounding darkness. Together, they form a chain of sentinels that testifies to our finitude and to our historical longing to join what lies beyond. Nonetheless, the dandy has often been a figure of ridicule. There is a kind of puritanism or disdain for beauty in the body that creeps into our philosophical discourse, a rigorous impulse that seeks to degrade the merely literary or aesthetic in favor of the scientific, the serious, or the intellectual. Within this discourse, the dandy is made to stand for everything the rigorous impulse seeks to oppose. Yet I want to argue, along with Michel Foucault, that this is a mistake. The Baudelaire's embrace of the dandy should force us to pause and reconsider, to challenge the notion that the aesthetic can ever truly be separated from our most profound ethical, political, and ontological commitments. Instead, I would contend, we should see the elaboration of an aesthetics of existence as a challenge to the world as it is and to our engagements therein. Before embracing the disdain of the dandy, we would do well to pause and think seriously about what a world that did not engage the aesthetics of our existence would actually entail. A gray world of power and calculation alone, one from which our enjoyments and pleasures were evacuated, from which all qualities had been reduced to the currency of the universal equivalent. What would freedom, justice, or the good look like in such a world? Would we even want them if they were not also beautiful? It is within this context that I would like to reconsider the fact that Foucault has often been accused of reducing the Stoics to a form of dandyism through his focus on the aesthetics of existence in ancient philosophy, and thus of a failure to appreciate their gravity. This is a charge he specifically denies in the hermeneutics of the subject. In the following year's lectures, Foucault opens with a reading of Kant's answer to the question, what is enlightenment? A text on which he published contemporaneously. In the published version, he specifically compares Kant's text to Baudelaire's The Painter of Modern Life, in which Baudelaire directly compares the figure of the dandy to the Stoics. In what follows, this paper will examine Hadot's charge that Foucault overemphasizes the aesthetic dimension of ancient philosophies of self-formation, reducing them to a form of dandyism. It will then look at Foucault's rethinking of the dandy in Baudelaire as a serious philosophical figure and not as a mere aesthete. It will close by returning to Hadot's contention that in ancient philosophy, ta kalon cannot be separated from ta agathon, and argue that Foucault, rather than reducing ethics to aesthetics, argues instead that the ethical, aesthetic, and epistemic are co-implicated and cannot be thought apart from one another. Okay, section 1. To recapitulate a well-known story, Pierre Hadot was a major influence on Foucault's thought throughout the 80s and the primary source for Foucault's concept of philosophy as a spiritual practice, a practice aimed at producing an art of existence through ethical self-formation. In 1977, Hadot, a professor of ancient and early Christian philosophy, had published an essay entitled Exercice Spirituel. There he argued that the principal aim of ancient philosophical discourse was not the elaboration of theoretical systems, but the formation of the spirit of the reader or the interlocutor. The aim of the discourse was a transformation of the interlocutor that allowed herself to be shaped and realized through a series of dialogical practices with herself, with a master and members of the community, and with texts. These exercises, Hadot contends, become most visible and formalized in the philosophers of the Hellenistic and Roman imperial periods. He uses the term spiritual to refer to them because words like psychic, moral, ethical, and intellectual all cover a portion of what he means, but they are each partial in relation to the phenomenon of a specifically philosophical self-formation. When Foucault began his work on the care of the self, he discovered Hadot's writings on ancient philosophy. They made a strong impression, and Foucault urged him to present his candidacy for a chair at the Collège de France, which he obtained in 1982. Foucault is in fact largely responsible for making Hadot's work known to the larger philosophical world. Unsurprisingly, however, these two men of very different backgrounds and experiences were not in complete agreement. Spirituality for Foucault falls under the larger category of the care of the self, where the latter was primarily an ethical concern in the sense of the formation of an ethos, character, disposition, self. The former had a distinctly epistemic character, referring to the formation or transformation of the self necessary to have access to the truth. Thus, in his May 6, 1981 lecture at Louvain, Foucault argued that one of the central tenets of ancient philosophy was that a certain style of life, what he would later refer to as an ascesis, was required to have access to the truth, and that this idea would later be central to Christian monasticism. This stylization or self-fashioning of the subject became known as the art, techne, the technology, or the aesthetics of existence, in the various later formulations it would receive before Foucault's death. These formulations owe a lot to Hadot himself, who says directly, "La philosophie antique propose à l'homme un art de vivre. Au contraire, la philosophie moderne se présente avant tout comme la construction d'un langage technique réservé à des spécialistes." Nonetheless, while Hadot recognizes the importance of Foucault's engagement with ancient philosophy in general and the Stoics in particular, after Foucault's death, he advanced certain decisive objections that have been taken up more widely. In particular, Hadot objects to Foucault's emphasis on the aesthetic, arguing that, en définissant son modèle éthique comme une esthétique de l'existence, Michel Foucault ne propose une culture de soi trop purement esthétique, c'est-à-dire, je le crains, une nouvelle forme de dandyisme version fin du XXe siècle. Well, the first time he makes this objection in print appears to be in an article in 1989, it is perhaps reasonable to assume he had already shared his view with Foucault directly. At any rate, Foucault seems aware of the charge as early as his 1982 course on the hermeneutics of the subject, where he specifically argues that to reduce the care of the self and the art of existence to a mere foppish dandyism or an unmediated aestheticism would be a mistake. Nonetheless, the topic predates Foucault. Paul Venn, as early as 1978, had embraced the term, arguing in the context of Seneca's approval of the conjugal bond, that it would be easy to show that other even more ascetic moralities, such as those of the Neo-Pythagoreans and Middle Platonists, were best viewed as aesthetic variations on this more general ethic. L'ascète est un dandy de la moralité. Nonetheless, Hadot's charge has stuck and has been widely repeated. Hadot zeroes in on one passage in Volume 3 of the History of Sexuality, where Foucault has emphasized the joy, gaudium, or pleasure, laetitia, to which Seneca says the care of the self gives rise. Hadot's contention is that Foucault misconstrues Seneca because Foucault understands this pleasure as being directly related to the turn inward to the self, where in Seneca, it is a question of the joy one finds in the better part of oneself. Likewise, where Foucault, according to Hadot, seems to equate gaudium with laetitia, the gaudium and laetitia with voluptas, translating all three with the word plaisir, Seneca in effect opposes them, arguing for the joy of self-possession over the life of pleasure. Le bonheur pour les stoïciens ne consiste pas dans le plaisir, mais dans la vertu elle-même, qui est à elle-même sa propre récompense. Let us place aside for a moment the question of whether one page in a multi-volume work dedicated to the topic of tracing the genealogy of the modern sexual subject to the figure of one who desires is sufficient to convict Foucault of transforming the Stoics into purely aesthetic dandies in the mode of Beau Brummel. Let us also set aside the fact that Hadot fails to engage the separate work Foucault was planning on the care of the self in ancient philosophy, and to which he had dedicated the last 3 years of his lectures at the Collège de France, but did not live to complete. The fact is that the passage to which Hadot refers, and on which consequently the argument of those who have followed in his wake depends, is more subtle than Hadot allows. Foucault begins by observing that the turning of the gaze of the self to the self, convertio, in Stoic philosophy was presented in terms of an ethic of mastery, which was characterized by an agonistic struggle between forces internal to the self, and that this self-relation was expressed in terms of a juridical model as witnessed by Seneca's use of phrases such as sui juris, and potestas sui. This initial description of the conversion of the self makes clear that Foucault is not talking about simple self-absorption or narcissism in Seneca. In fact, he outlines a relation between one part of the self, which wields power, and the other parts, which would be subject to the law and therefore subordinate to the superior part. It is within this relation of self-regulation and self-possession that Foucault, Hadot, and Seneca all locate gaudium and laetitia. And as Foucault explicitly acknowledges, cette sorte de plaisir, i.e. gaudium and laetitia, peut être opposé trait pour trait à ce qui est désigné par le terme voluptas. Celui-ci désigne un plaisir dont l'origine est à placer hors de nous et dans des objets dont la présence ne nous est pas assurée. Whether Foucault makes an error in translating all three terms with the French plaisir is surely a minor point, when it is clear that he understands the distinctions and acknowledges that Seneca is making it. Hadot might well respond nonetheless that Foucault, by emphasizing pleasure and the aesthetic, gives short shrift to what the Stoics viewed as the universal. Hadot contends that the joy Seneca finds in his self is not a joy in his own ego, but rather in the better part of his self, which Hadot claims to be identified with perfect divine reason and is therefore a transcendence of the self rather than an affirmation of it. This perfect divine reason, in turn, is what he identifies as a cosmic consciousness. The liberation from suffering and the gaudium promised by ancient philosophy in general and Stoicism in particular is effectuated by a passage from the suffering individual subject to the universal perspective of the cosmic whole. One effects this passage by performing a series of practices through which the subject refashions herself so as to bring the relation between the better part and the subordinate parts of herself into alignment with universal reason. Hadot at times verges on the mystical. He argues that a return to such a concept of universal reason and to the cosmic dimension of existence is both possible and desirable for individuals in the modern world. He sees the emphasis on the aesthetic as a truncated version of this more comprehensive vision of a universal understanding, one that has been made necessary by the rise of modern science. Aesthetic perception has become a mode for people to conserve a consciousness of that, quote, cosmic dimension that is necessary to human existence, close quote. This reduction of the cosmic to the aesthetic signals for him an attenuation of its full epistemic and spiritual force. The disagreement between Hadot and Foucault is clearly about more than the interpretation of gaudium and voluptas in Seneca's text. Now, it is certainly true that neither universal reason nor cosmic consciousness appear on the pages in question from the history of sexuality, nor to my knowledge are they the focus of Foucault's exposition anywhere within the 4 volumes. Nonetheless, as I have shown elsewhere at more length, Foucault was hardly unaware of these aspects of Stoic philosophy, even if they did not occupy the center of his attention. Indeed, in the final lecture of 1982's Hermeneutics of the Subject, Foucault acknowledges that in Hellenistic philosophy, at its culmination, one lives not for one's possession, one's power, or any of the other numerous things in the world that the Stoics labeled adiaphora, indifference. One lives for oneself in the sense of becoming indistinguishable from reason and God, from the cosmos itself. One has transformed oneself so that the best parts of the self rule over those which are the worst. And so the subject becomes united with universal reason itself. Quote, between the rational God who, in the order of the world, places around me all the elements, the entire long chain of dangers and misfortunes, and myself, who is going to decipher these misfortunes as so many tests and exercises for my perfection. Between this God and me, there is henceforth only myself, close quote. The self becomes identified with the rational principle of the world and thence views all its experience, all its suffering as a means towards its perfection. The spiritual practices of the Hellenistic and Roman imperial philosophy are not aimed at a shallow or immediate pleasure in the self, and Foucault does not argue that. They are aimed at the subject experiencing a plenitude it has never known, an absolute freedom from contingency and error, from the deceptions of attachment, and hence from the illusion of the self's own separation from physis or nature. To reduce the care of the self, either to solipsism, to a mere foppish dandyism, or to an unmediated aestheticism, Foucault says from the beginning would be a mistake. That, however, is something very different from separating the care of the self and its associated spiritual practices from either pleasure in the broadest sense or the aesthetic per se. Section 2, quote from Baudelaire's Painter of Modern Life. Whether these men be called refined, unbelievable, beautiful, lions, or dandies, all are issued from the same origin. All participate in the same character of opposition and revolt. All are representatives of what is best in human pride, of that need, too rare today, to combat and destroy triviality. And then a quotation from Kant's answer to the question of what is enlightenment. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding. Foucault opens his 1983 lecture course on the government of the self and others, which continues his work from the previous year's hermeneutics of the subject, with a reading of Kant's answer to the question, what is enlightenment? In May 1984, shortly before his death, he published an extract from this lecture in the magazine Littéraire. He also published an English translation, What is Enlightenment?, an expanded essay built around the same material. In this expanded treatment, he makes an explicit comparison between Kant's conception of enlightenment and Baudelaire's project of modernity. Both Kant and Baudelaire stress an acute awareness of the nature of the present as a moment of decision, a moment in which autonomy of judgment can be exercised or refused, a moment in which a consciousness of freedom can arise. Foucault uses this unlikely conjunction of Kant and Baudelaire to ask the question of whether we cannot envision modernity less as a period than as an attitude. Quote, a manner of thinking and feeling, a manner also of acting and conducting oneself, which at once marks our adherence and our task. A little, no doubt, like what the Greeks called an ethos, close quote. Thus, if enlightenment for Kant is both the name of the present and a recurring moment in which the self emancipates itself from tutelage to external authority, for Baudelaire, modernity is a recognition of the will to heroize the present. It is, as Foucault avers, a moment of transfiguration, a moment of the difficult interplay between the truth of the real and the exercise of freedom. This transfiguration of the self requires the practice of a certain asceticism. Quote, to be modern is not to accept oneself just as one is, in the flux of moments that pass. It is not passively to accept, with cowardice or laziness, one's minority and hence conformity. Rather, quote, it is to take oneself as the object of a complex and difficult elaboration, what Baudelaire calls in the vocabulary of the time, dandyism, close quote. Foucault is precise with his language here. He does not claim that Kant was a dandy, nor does he claim that what Baudelaire terms a dandy is what it means in the vocabulary of Foucault's time. Rather, he observes that for Kant, enlightenment is a process of self-emancipation that can only take place in a present defined as what is actual at this moment, as the active sum of the past that opens into the future. And this practice of emancipation necessarily entails a process of self-formation or transfiguration in which the subject frees itself from an unthinking, unreasoning submission to the structures of what has been, to the flux of moments that pass. By the same token, for Baudelaire, modern man is not he who sets off to discover himself, his secrets and his hidden truth. He is the one that searches to invent himself. For Foucault, Kant's text formulates the problem of the relation between the government of the self and others through its focus on the autonomy of the individual's knowledge of truth in relation to various forms of authority. While we generally associate the early Foucault with a certain effacement of the subject, seeing the problematic of the self as a development in his later ethical turn, in fact, Kant's views on freedom had been a topic of interest since at least his minor thesis on the anthropology. In particular, Foucault's later interest is primarily focused on the question of what is the present moment. That is to say, how do we recognize ourselves within the present moment and thereby preserve our ability both to think and ultimately to act differently. Foucault understands his own concept of critique to be close to Kant's, in that both ask, what is the ontology of the present? Where Kant says, dare to know, Foucault asks, what is the field of our experience? What is its genealogy, and how can I think beyond its limits? Or even more precisely, how can I form myself to think differently? Thus, Foucault will argue that Kant's distinction between majority and minority in the passage quoted above rests on liberating reason from public conformity and obedience, even while we may and ultimately must privately obey. We cannot each decide the norms we will adhere to in private life on an ad hoc basis, whether it be paying the rent, showing up for work, or other basic forms of decorum. These are not the dictates of universal reason, but mere whim or momentary advantage. However, Foucault argues, quote, when to obey is confused with not reasoning, and when in the confusion of obeying and not reasoning, one oppresses what ought to be the public and universal usage of our understanding, at this moment there is minority, close quote. The loss of autonomy stems from our acceptance of a certain type of self-relation. Quote, and this is Kant, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large proportion of men, even when nature has long emancipated them from alien guidance, nevertheless gladly remain immature for life, close quote. The question becomes, what sort of discourse must one undertake to change this self-relation, to fashion oneself to become what Foucault in his study of ancient parousia calls a fearless speaker of truth. For Foucault, this problematic of self-formation is what constitutes the immediate philosophical relevance of both the Stoic care of the self and Baudelaire's formulation of the dandy. For there is no shaping of the self by the self that is not at the same time a stylization of one's existence, an aesthetics and an art of living, not in opposition to reason and its most universalizing aspirations, but precisely as its enactment, as a mature, emancipated act of truth. Thus, when Baudelaire speaks of dandies as lions of opposition and revolt, he does so not in opposition to ethics, politics, or reason, but as their instantiation. Quote, one sees that from a certain perspective, dandyism borders on spirituality and stoicism, but a dandy is not able to be a vulgar man. Let the reader not be scandalized by this seriousness and frivolity. Let him remember that there is a greatness even in follies, a force even in excess, a queer spirituality, close quote. Thus, Foucault would argue that rather than reducing the cosmic consciousness of the Stoics to mere dandyism, rather than his doing that, it is precisely Hadot who reduces the challenge of the dandy to mere aestheticism. as if the question of what we consider the beautiful can ever be radically separated from what we understand to be the good. Ascesis, spiritual practice, does not allow you to access true discourses and thus to know, but it allows you to be the subject of those discourses, to be united with a certain vision of the world, and thus to come to resemble what you would want to be. Baudelaire makes the connection between the Stoic and the dandy, not because Stoicism is a trivial pursuit of style for its own sake, but because there is always a seriousness and a spirituality in what to the untrained eye seems frivolous. In the strange figure of the philosopher who withdraws from the world to seek wisdom, who leaves the cave of normal life in order to see things in the clear light of the sun, who pursues a vision of spiritual beauty even among the blooming evils of the Paris streets. The dandy for Baudelaire is precisely the lion who refuses to accept the triviality of day-to-day existence as constituting the limits of the world. So while it is a mistake to argue that Foucault reduces Stoicism to dandyism, he quite explicitly does not. It is important to recall that, as Prado observed, his reflections on ancient modes of subjectivation were always a means to find a way beyond the normalized subject of the present, and that as such, his queer spirituality was anything but reductive or trivial. Conclusion. There is then no small irony in the fact that Hadot, in his essay from the revised edition of Exercices spirituels et philosophie antique, Un dialogue interrompu avec Michel Foucault, Convergence et Divergence, makes the argument that, quote, the word aesthetic evokes in effect for us moderns very different resonances from those that the word beauty, kalon, kalos, had in antiquity. In effect, moderns have a tendency to represent the beautiful to themselves as an autonomous reality, independent of good and evil. Whereas for the Greeks, in contrast, the word, when applied to human beings, normally implies a moral value. In short, he accuses Foucault of failing to recognize one of the most basic lessons of the symposium, that ta kalon is an aspect of ta agathon. But as we have seen, in fact, Foucault never argues for the autonomy of the aesthetic, and he explicitly repudiates any conception of the dandy in that sense. He most certainly does not pair Kant with Baudelaire's reading of the painter of modern life to argue that Kant's concept of majority is equivalent or reducible to either a bloodless aestheticism or some simplistic notion of l'art pour l'art. Rather, had he lived, he might well have retorted that it was in fact Hadot who sought to separate ta kalon from ta agathon, and thus see what is beautiful and fine as apart from what is good, and that it was Hadot's contention rather than his own that the question of how we form ourselves as ethical, epistemic, and spiritual beings could be separated from what we value, what we love, and what we think it might be beautiful to be. For Foucault, the study of the art of living was never a retreat from politics, but it was the art of living that established the point of contact between the subject, its self-relation, and the government of the self and others. Who we understand ourselves to be and who we want to be, what we find admirable, cannot be separated from how power is exercised upon us and how we choose to resist. In forming ourselves to think differently, we change who we are. We change the nature of ourselves. We change the ontology of the present. This was integral to Foucault's project from beginning to end. Foucault always saw his work as a form of self-fashioning, as a way of changing who he was. This was not just a solipsistic retreat into the self, a refusal of community, politics, and the good, but a way of creating new possibilities for life, new technologies of the self that are directly useful to the public, particularly to excluded oppressed groups that have not been able to speak in their own voice. These are new forms of beauty, products of rigor and discipline, products of careful and patient work in the archive from which the present has sprung, all in the effort to create new forms of existence. And I'll close with another stanza from Baudelaire. Ce ne seront jamais ces beautés de vignettes, produits avariés, nés d'un siècle vaurien. Ces pieds à brodequins, ces doigts à castagnettes, qui sauront satisfaire un cœur comme le mien. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting and thought-provoking dialogue between moderns, ancients, and contemporary thinkers. And we'll now go to the discussion. So are there any questions at this point? Paulo, you may start.
You unmute. Thank you very much, Paul, for this wonderful talk. It's really a pleasure to hear you. It's the first time I hear you, but I know your books, some of them, not many of them, some of them quite well. Thank you also for that. I'd like to ask you a question about the dandy, the figure of the dandy, which is a pivotal point in your presentation. You know, I would like to ask you, has the dandy the same meaning today as it had for Baudelaire? That is, as you quoted from Baudelaire, does it mean? Does it represent? Does he or her represent the dandy today a break with triviality? That is not the dandy sort of today's triviality, so that a break with triviality requires a different attitude from dandyism. And I ask you this because, as you also mentioned it at the end of your paper, this is very important for Foucault, because Foucault, the guiding principle, so to speak, of Foucault's thinking from the beginning onwards is how to be in movement, how to be in constant change in terms of thinking, so that to find a way of doing this at a moment when dandyism is no longer this break with triviality, this would require a different attitude. This is my question. Thank you.
Are there any other questions at this point? Federico?
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. I had the chance to read the paper, so it was great to hear your presentation. There's a question that I think I've asked you already, but I would like to invite you to speak a bit more about this, because I think it's a really interesting point. I think there's something very unusual and not self-evident about the way in which Foucault brings together Kant and Baudelaire. And I think it's in sort of a, it could seem very strange for a reader of Kant, I think, or for a reader of Baudelaire to see these two figures together. So I'd like to invite you to speak a little bit more about this encounter. Perhaps, and I'll leave like a suggestion to see maybe if you think it's a good way to go about this. Foucault emphasizes the idea that, you know, the attitude of enlightenment in Kant has to do with a certain attention to the present. And it seems that also in Baudelaire, there is, even though Foucault doesn't really mention it, but in the Painter of Modern Life, there's this idea of modernity as being the ephemeral, the fugitive, that which passes, right? But and the task of art would be to somehow capture something that goes beyond that. So the eternal, he says at some point. So I was wondering if that the point of connection between Kant and Baudelaire is a certain particular form of attention to the present. And the second point I'd like to ask is, well, there is a definition of beauty Baudelaire is sort of defining beauty in a certain way. Do you think that this definition of beauty, concerned with this attention to the present and capturing the traces of eternity in the present, is that somehow something that relates back to the idea of the aesthetics, the aesthetic of existence? Is that, would you associate these two things? Thank you.
Thank you. And I don't see any other questions, so I'll add one of my own to the list, if you don't mind. I was wondering if there is, if you see any connection between this criticism of Hadot to Foucault regarding this overemphasis of the, or concentration on the aesthetic component, and what we could describe as the normative dimension of philosophy. So can we understand this also as a criticism to an interpretation of ancient philosophy that focused too much on self-shaping, on which suggests a kind of arbitrariness that we can create ourselves in a multitude of different ways, and that it would not be entirely appropriate, at least to ancient philosophy, although very appropriate for modern philosophy? Or you don't see any connection at all between this problem that I'm now mentioning and what and Hadot's critique to Foucault?
Okay, thank you everyone for three really interesting sets of questions. So Paulo, does the dandy have the same meaning now as it did in time of Baudelaire? No, I think not in common usage, certainly. I mean, there are a series of commercials that are on TV right now in the United States that feature Elton John and Nas, and they are elaborately dressed in all these commercials, and it's very much this kind of dandy-esque self-presentation. It's advertising Uber Eats of all things, and so there is that element, but Baudelaire is specifically trying to recapture a notion of fashioning the self as a kind of aesthetic protest against the conformity of Parisian, for lack of a better term, bourgeois life at the time, and really seeing the reformulation of modernity through the practices of art, and through a practice of art that focuses on the daily life of people in Paris at that time, and even kind of a non-heroic formation, and so I think it's important to remember, the whole, how revolutionary Les Fleurs du Mal were, in terms of either neoclassical or romantic aesthetics. Before then, there was this, real sense, as he says, I'm taking the mud of the streets and I'm forming it into gold. There is this beauty and ugliness that Les Fleurs du Mal, the Baudelaire is very interested in, and certainly dandyism per se, as it's normally perceived right now, is doesn't necessarily entail that. What Foucault's really interested in this, I think, is, it's interesting that in many of these same lectures, he starts talking about like the revolutionary ethos, the forming of the self in the 19th century as a revolutionary, as a specific, not so much talking about the specific political programs, but as a certain kind of ideal of the formation of the self. People like Rosa Luxemburg or Emma Goldman, or who we would certainly not think of as dandies. But I think the point is that if you want to be something different, if you want to govern yourself and potentially govern others in a different way, you must reform yourself, not just in the sense of a reformation, but literally to reform yourself. And that involves an aesthetic sense. And that involves a sense of what is admirable, what is ta kalon at that moment. And so by going to Baudelaire, he really, I think, recuperates that notion from there. And I think he's very much speaking back against this notion that somehow in focusing on the aesthetics in the Stoics, of himself reducing them to dandies, which he says he doesn't, but he's kind of going back and I think saying, okay, you want to say that I'm reducing the Stoics to dandies? Fine. Let's talk about what it might actually mean to be a dandy. Let's actually problematize that and think about that in a serious way, which I think is a very interesting move. And that kind of leads me into Federico's comment, Kant and Baudelaire, which, yes, it's obviously a provocative combination. And I have no evidence for this whatsoever, but I constantly think about this, and I would love to someday do a more systematic reading, sit down and think about this in terms of Lacan's Kant avec Sade. I mean, it seems almost too close for it to be completely accidental, although there is no reference to Lacan or psychoanalysis. So you'd have to really do a close reading to tease it out. He does say that there are two aspects of Kant. That there are two different kinds of reading of Kant. There's the Kant who really sort of gets taken up in terms of epistemology and even parts of analytic philosophy. And then there is what he says the critical Kant who asks the question of what is the present? What is the ontology of the present? And he's more interested in that side of Kant. So, I mean, he recognizes that there are other readings of Kant and there's even other strands within Kant that he's not paying attention to. And so he is being selective here in a self-conscious way. But of course, by pairing someone who is, by some notions, as humorless as Kant can be, with Baudelaire, he is challenging us to really think about the seriousness of Baudelaire, I think, more than he's trying to trivialize Kant. And this notion of the modern as the fugitive, which I really like, and the way it sort of laps up against the eternal, or at least sort of gestures towards it in a certain way. I mean, that was very much what I thought was at play in that last line of the final stanza of Les Phares, et viens mourir au bord de votre éternité. So there's this aspiration, but that doesn't reach eternity, right? It dies right at the edge of it, and so I think there's that sort of dialectic within Baudelaire where there's this sort of desire to move beyond the immediate, and also a constant recognition of failure. There's something almost a little bit like in the symposium, where there's only the gods have Sophia, and the philosopher, the human, can only have the love of philosophy, but can never actually attain Sophia per se. Baudelaire's concept of beauty. Well, I talked about that a little earlier, and it is, I think, not separable from ugliness. I mean, you know, think of La Charogne, you know, the poem on the rotting carcass. You know, it's probably one of the best examples of it. But it is always this sort of ironic aspiration that is, I think, really central to Baudelaire, and that I think it gives Foucault a kind of lever there. So Hélder, your question was really interesting, you know, and you know, is there a kind of criticism here, if I understood you correctly, in Hadot? Is Hadot criticizing a certain notion that Foucault is saying that, you know, you can take this ancient philosophy and use it to make you anything you want to be, and so it's this kind of unlimited self-formation. And I think that is what Hadot says. I don't think that's actually what Foucault says, you know, but I do think that is part of Hadot's worry. There's an essay, and I'm forgetting the name right now, that Paul Venn did many years ago on Foucault. And he's speaking about the charge that was sometimes made by people in American classics, that, you know, what Foucault was doing was sort of idealizing the Greeks, and that, you know, we were all supposed to become Greeks, that was Foucault's project, which it clearly wasn't. But Venn has an interesting response. And he says that, you know, what Foucault's essentially trying to do is provide us with a different card. We're playing a game. We have certain moves we can make, and we have a certain number of cards we can play. And through this genealogy, through this archaeology, through this examination of a different form of self-relation and a different relationship to our desire, it's not that we can become that, or that we should want to become that, or that we can become anything we want. But it does offer a distance. It does offer perhaps a different card we can play that doesn't by itself change the rules of the game we are playing, but offers different options within that. And conceivably, if one has enough different options, then one does in fact start to begin to write the rules, but not in a sort of absolute way of complete freedom. You know, you are both taking something that has a certain form to it that you have to pay attention to its details and its logic, and then you are using it or transplanting it into a different situation that has its own logic and its own set of rules within it. But hopefully that produces some useful tensions and opportunities that weren't there before.
Thank you, that's very convincing. Marta, you also have a question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very short question. First of all, thank you for your talk. It's a pleasure to finally listen to you. It's, as I said, a very short question. I really like this connection that established between aesthetics of existence and the revolution or reformation of the world. And you have stressed that, you have emphasized that in your paper, that basically this aesthetics of existence equates to a challenge to the world as it is, and that somehow not practicing this aesthetics of existence is just to let the world be as it is. How do you relate this with a certain objection that has been made to Foucault and also to the tradition to which he relates, with this idea of aesthetics of existence, of being of this aesthetics of existence being rather connected with the transformation of the self, and as opposed to a transformation of the world. So there is often this objection that, for example, Hellenistic ethics is too much concerned with oneself, even with individualistic happiness and so on, and that this happens in independence of a change in the world. So you change yourself so that the world doesn't affect you so much, so to say, so that you can be happy, achieve this completeness independently of the circumstances you are in. So do you see this conflict between the ideal of aesthetics of existence and the transformation of the world, or between ethics and politics in this case, or not so much? Thank you.
I see that, I understand the argument, but I think Foucault's responses would be that all forms of power, in order to function, have to have an interface with the subject, with people, and how people form themselves. So there's an image that he uses of, there's a kind of chain between the largest macro structures down to the subject self-relation. And that while every change in the subject self-relation is not going to change those relationships of power, on the other hand, you cannot change those relationships of power without changing the nature of the subject. And there are certain ways in which this becomes rather obvious. If you think about one of the things that you look at the early Russian Revolution, there's a lot of question about producing the new Soviet man, right? There is a sense that, people are not going to be the same, not just simply on this macro level of we're going to have a 5-year plan, we're going to do a lot of planning, and it's going to be great, but in the way people actually live their lives, in the way they structure their interiority, in the way they structure their relations with other people. So, so taking it sort of from the other side, then, if that is true, then there's going to always be this kind of interplay. That it doesn't mean that, we should all go, I don't know, join a new age colony somewhere in California and rub crystals, that will, somehow stop global warming, but it does mean that we can't change the way we live in the world without changing ourselves. And we probably can't, I would say, I don't know if Foucault would say, that the corollary of that is we cannot change the world without changing the way we live. And that involves, refashioning our desire, our notion of what is, the good, the just, the beautiful, to go back to Plato.